She is a parasite. My mother-in-law's voice cracked through the silence of the conference room like a whip. She latched onto my son when he was at his most vulnerable. And now she has the audacity to sit here and act like she deserves anything from this family. She was standing at the head of the long mahogany table, one hand pressed flat against the polished wood, the other pointing directly at me. Her diamond rings caught the overhead light with every jab of her finger. The veins in her neck were visible from across the room. I sat completely still. My hands were folded in my lap. My breathing was even. I had worn my plain gray blazer deliberately, the one I bought 3 years ago at a department store sale, the one my mother-in-law had once called aggressively modest. I had not touched my coffee. I had not looked at anyone except the attorney sitting at the far end of the table, whose name placard read Garrett Holloway, Estate Counsel, and who was watching my mother-in-law the way a man watches a car slowly rolling toward a cliff. She never worked a real job in her life, my mother-in-law continued, smoothing her blazer with trembling hands. She contributed nothing to this family. She contributed nothing to my son's success, and I will not sit here and watch a woman who drove a 12-year-old Honda Civic to her own wedding walk away with a single cent of what Marcus built. Across the table, my brother-in-law shifted in his seat. His wife stared at the untouched fruit plate in the center of the table. My sister-in-law was looking at her phone, which she had been doing since we sat down, which meant she already knew how this was going to go. She had always been better at reading her mother than anyone else in the room. I looked at the clock on the wall. 7:04 am. Right on schedule. Before I tell you what was in those files that made my mother-in-law go completely silent for the first time in 26 years, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I love knowing who's part of our community. The conference room on the 42nd floor of Holloway and Marsh smelled like old paper and expensive carpet cleaner. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Chicago skyline was doing what it always did in November, performing indifference at 31 degrees. I had always loved this city in winter. Everything stripped down to its bones. No pretense, no decoration, just structure and cold and the truth of what things were made of. My husband Marcus had loved it too. He had died 11 months ago. A cardiac event at 51, which was the medical system's polite way of saying the man had worked himself to death in a corner office, while his mother called every Thursday afternoon to remind him that the family business was his responsibility, his legacy, his obligation, and that whatever else he had chosen to do with his personal life was secondary to the Alderton name. Whatever else he had chosen to do with his personal life, that was me. I had met Marcus at a conference in Atlanta 6 years ago. I was 31. He was 45. He walked up to me during the cocktail hour, bypassing the open bar entirely, and asked me what I thought about the panel discussion on supply chain auditing. Most men at those events asked where I was staying. Marcus asked what I actually thought. I married him 14 months later in a small ceremony in Asheville with 37 guests, a string quartet, and my mother-in-law crying in the front row in a way that had nothing to do with happiness. She had never used my name in 6 years. Not once. She called me her when she talked about me to others and you when she talked to me directly. When Marcus had introduced me to his board of directors, she had smiled the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes and said, "How lovely that Marcus finally found someone patient enough to manage his schedule." When I had mentioned carefully, over dinner once, that I ran my own firm, she had tilted her head and said, "Of course you do, sweetheart," with the exact same tone she used when her Labrador retriever dropped a tennis ball at her feet. I had smiled and eaten my salmon. I had been eating a lot of salmon in silence for 6 years. The attorney cleared his throat. "Mrs. Alderton, if I could ask you to please take your seat so we can continue with the reading of the estate document. I'm not finished." My mother-in-law turned toward Garrett Holloway with the full force of a woman who had spent 5 decades never being told no. She signed a prenuptial agreement. Whatever Marcus may have included in this document under emotional duress is contestable, and I fully intend to contest it. "The prenuptial agreement covers marital assets," Garrett said, keeping his voice professionally neutral. "What we're discussing today includes holdings that predate the marriage and certain instruments that were structured independently of the marital estate." "She doesn't have independent holdings." My mother-in-law laughed. It was the kind of laugh that wasn't a laugh at all but a performance of disbelief, designed to make everyone in the room feel embarrassed for the person being discussed. She drove a 12-year-old Honda Civic. She bought her dress at a consignment shop. My son supported her completely. I looked at the clock again. 10:16. My mother-in-law was talking about the Honda. She had mentioned the Honda already twice this morning and 3 times at the funeral, and at least a dozen times in the 6 years I had been her daughter-in-law. I had driven it deliberately, not because I couldn't afford something else, but because it ran perfectly, and because there is a specific kind of woman who decides what you're worth based on what you drive. And I had learned a long time ago that the most useful thing you could do around that kind of woman was let her keep believing what she wanted to believe. Let me tell you about my mother-in-law's company. Alderton Industrial Supply had been in business for 40 years. It distributed commercial equipment across the Midwest, and it had been her late husband's company before it became hers. And it had been profitable for most of those 4 decades, until the supply chain disruptions of the early 2020s had exposed a series of structural weaknesses that her management team had been quietly papering over for years, with short-term credit. I knew this because I had audited companies like hers for 12 years. I ran a firm called Meridian Consulting Group. We specialized in financial forensics, finding the money that was missing, mapping the debt that was hidden, identifying the instruments that were about to detonate. We had 14 full-time staff and 3 federal contracts, and a client list I kept off my personal social media, because the work required discretion, and because my mother-in-law was the kind of woman who Googled people. She had never Googled me. Not properly. Not past the first page of results, which mostly showed a conference panel I had been on in 2019, and a LinkedIn profile I kept intentionally sparse. 3 years ago, when Marcus told me quietly one evening that his mother's company was in serious financial trouble, that she had taken on 2 rounds of high-interest bridge loans to cover an inventory shortfall, and was now 6 weeks from a liquidity crisis, I had already known for 4 months. I had known because 2 of the lenders she had borrowed from were clients of mine, and because in this industry, when a company of that size starts missing covenant thresholds, the right people hear about it. Marcus had looked at me across the kitchen counter that night, tired in the way he always looked when his mother was the subject, and said he felt like he had to do something, that she would never ask for help, that she would rather lose the company than admit to the family that it was failing. I told him I would handle it. He had looked at me for a long moment and then nodded, the way he always did when he had decided to trust me completely, which was the thing about Marcus that I had loved most and that his mother had never once understood about her own son. The next morning I called my attorney. I incorporated a new entity. I named it Cornerstone Capital Partners, registered in Delaware, operating address a small suite in a shared office building 3 miles from our apartment. Clean, anonymous, vague enough that no one would look twice. Through Cornerstone, I approached my mother-in-law's primary lender and offered to purchase the 2 outstanding loan facilities at a modest discount. The bank, which had been quietly uncomfortable with the exposure for months, was happy to move them off the books. I paid $3,400,000. I had it. I had been building Meridian for 12 years, and I had been careful with money in a way that would have surprised everyone who had ever commented on my department store blazer. And I had been a senior secured creditor before, and I knew exactly what that meant and what it would allow me to do if I ever needed to do it. My mother-in-law never knew. Her loan statements continued to arrive from a servicer. The name Cornerstone Capital Partners appeared in the fine print of documents she signed without reading, because she had an attorney for that, and her attorney had processed the assignment paperwork without flagging it to her as anything unusual, because technically it wasn't. Debt gets bought and sold every day. She continued to make her quarterly payments. She continued to call me her at family dinners. She continued to mention the Honda. Marcus died before I ever had to use what I had built. When he was gone, I sat in our apartment for 2 weeks, and did not go to the office and did not return most calls. And then one morning I got up and put on the gray blazer and went back to work because that was what I knew how to do, and because the alternative was dissolving, and I had not spent 12 years building something to dissolve. My mother-in-law had called me the week after the funeral to let me know she had retained an attorney. I had thanked her for letting me know. This is not a negotiation. My mother-in-law's voice snapped me back to the conference room. She had finally sat down, but the energy in her body was still standing up, still braced for a fight she was certain she was going to win. My son's estate belongs to his children and to his family, not to a woman who was barely married to him. 5 years. 6, I said. It was the first time I had spoken. My mother-in-law blinked. Across the table, my brother-in-law looked up. My sister-in-law stopped scrolling. 6 years, I said, keeping my voice even. We were married for 6 years, 2 months, and 11 days. My mother-in-law's expression hardened into something that had moved past contempt into a territory I didn't have a word for. Fine. 6 years. During which time you contributed nothing financially to this family, nothing professionally, nothing of substance. She turned back to Garrett. The prenuptial agreement is clear. She gets the personal effects and the joint checking account. That was the agreement. That is what she gets. Garrett folded his hands on the table. Mrs. Alderton, the prenuptial agreement is not in dispute. What I need to discuss with you today is a separate matter entirely. He reached for the first of 3 folders stacked to his right. Specifically, the financial instruments connected to Alderton Industrial Supply that are currently held by a third party. My mother-in-law straightened. What third party? Garrett slid the first folder across the table. She opened it. The room went very quiet. Not the kind of quiet that comes from nothing happening. The kind that comes from too many things happening at once inside one person's mind, all of them crashing into each other, none of them making sense yet. I had been in enough rooms at enough moments like this to recognize the specific quality of that silence. The intake of breath that doesn't quite become a breath. The eyes moving too fast across a page. The hand that goes very still on the table. My mother-in-law's hand went very still on the table. "This is wrong," she said, but her voice had lost something. The weight it usually carried. The certainty. "This is incorrect. Cornerstone Capital Partners is our lender. They've been our lender for 3 years. They're a private equity group out of." She looked up at Garrett. "What is this?" "The incorporation documents for Cornerstone Capital Partners," Garrett said. "Filed in Delaware. 3 years ago. The sole owner and managing director is listed on page 2. My mother-in-law turned to page 2. I watched her read my name. I watched her read it twice. And then I watched something move through her face that I had never seen there before in 6 years of family dinners, and holiday gatherings, and hospital waiting rooms, and everything else we had been through together as women connected by the same man. Something that was not anger, and was not contempt, and was not the dismissive performance she had perfected over a lifetime of being the most important person in every room she entered. It was the specific expression of a person who has just realized the floor they were standing on was not the floor they thought it was. "No," she said. The word came out flat, not a protest, almost a statement of physics, like saying gravity doesn't work this way. "No, that's not possible." "She doesn't." She looked at me. "You don't have $3 million. "I did 3 years ago," I said. "I have significantly more now." "You drove a Honda Civic." "I drove a Honda Civic," I confirmed. The silence stretched. My brother-in-law leaned over and looked at the document his mother was holding. I watched the exact moment he understood it, because he set the document down very carefully, the way you set something down when you're afraid of what your hands might do if they're not occupied. My mother-in-law found her footing again. She always did. That was the thing about her that I had always, despite everything, respected. She did not stay down. She came back up, and the angle of her chin reset, and her voice returned to its usual register of absolute authority. "This doesn't change anything," she said. "Whatever she may have arranged as a separate business matter, it is completely unrelated to Marcus's estate. Whatever she is owed as a creditor, she can collect through the appropriate channels. That is a business transaction. It has nothing to do with this family's assets." "You're right," I said. My mother-in-law paused. "It's completely separate," I continued, "which is why I haven't mentioned it until now. As a creditor, I have my own instruments, and my own counsel, and my own process." I glanced at Garrett, who gave me the smallest, most professionally restrained nod I had ever seen. "What I'm here for today has nothing to do with Cornerstone." "Then why bring it up at all?" "I didn't," I said. "Garrett did. Because there's a provision in the loan documents that requires disclosure in the event of the primary guarantor's death." My mother-in-law's face went very still. "Marcus was the personal guarantor," I said. "He signed the guarantee 3 years ago when Cornerstone restructured the loan terms. Section 4. Personal guarantee. Cross-collateralization clause. Standard language. Your company attorney reviewed it and cleared it. Marcus signed a guarantee for a loan he didn't know was held by his own wife." My mother-in-law's voice had taken on a new quality, not loud now, precise, like a scalpel. "You are telling me that my son unknowingly backed a financial instrument controlled by you." "Marcus knew exactly who held that loan," I said quietly. "He asked me to handle it. He trusted me to handle it. He signed the guarantee with full knowledge of what he was signing. I let that settle for a moment. He trusted me. He always trusted me." The scalpel quality left her voice. Something else came in. I looked at the clock. 10:31. "Marcus is gone," I continued, keeping my voice steady and without sharpness, because this was not a moment for sharpness, which means the personal guarantee transfers to the estate, which means the loan, currently carrying a balance of $2.8 million, now has a claim against the estate assets. I paused. Specifically against the 40% ownership stake Marcus held in Alderton Industrial Supply. My mother-in-law stood up. Not dramatically. She just stood. The way a person stands when sitting has become physically impossible. "You planned this," she said. "You have been planning this from the beginning. Everything about you has been a lie. You came into this family with an agenda, and you used my son." "I loved your son," I said. The room went silent again. "I loved your son, and he knew it, and I would give back every asset, and every instrument, and every dollar in every account I have ever held, if it meant he was still here. But he is not here." I felt the steadiness of my own voice as though it belonged to someone else. "And I have been patient, and I have been quiet, and I have eaten 6 years of your contempt without comment, because that is what Marcus asked me to do, because he loved you, and because I loved him. But I am not going to sit here today and be called a parasite in front of his children's attorney, while you try to take the last thing he left me." My sister-in-law had put her phone on the table face down. My mother-in-law was still standing, but something had shifted in her posture, a degree or two, the way a building shifts before an engineer notices. "I will challenge every document in that folder," she said. "Every signature, every clause. I will tie this up in litigation for 3 years." "You can," I said. "You're welcome to. Litigation takes time and money." Cornerstone, as the senior secured creditor, would continue to accrue interest during that period and would retain the right to call the note under the default provision in the guarantee. I let that settle. The default provision that was triggered this morning when you stated publicly, on the record, in front of a licensed attorney, that my professional holdings were fraudulent. My mother-in-law's attorney, who had been sitting very quietly at the end of the table since we arrived, made a sound like a man who has just been informed that the bridge he is standing on was condemned 2 weeks ago. "Paragraph 9, I said. "Defamatory statement regarding the creditor's business practices constitutes an event of default. You called Cornerstone a fraudulent entity." I looked at her directly. "You called me a fraud. Twice. On the record." That triggered the acceleration clause. "The note is callable today." Garrett opened the second folder. My mother-in-law sat back down. The second folder contained the acceleration notice, already prepared, dated that morning. It also contained a summary of the collateral, equipment, receivables, the 2 commercial vehicles the company owned outright, and the office property on West Fulton that her late husband had bought in 1987, and that she had always spoken about with the specific reverence reserved for things you believe are permanent. "You don't want to call that note," she said. But the authority was gone from her voice. She was negotiating now. I could hear it. The shift from declaration to calculation. "Calling the note destroys the company. 40 years of my family's work." "I know," I said. "Hundreds of employees." "I know. You would do that? You would do that to his family?" I looked at her for a long moment. "I'm not calling the note," I said. The room inhaled. "I have no interest in destroying what your husband spent 40 years building, or what your employees depend on for their livelihoods. I never did." I reached forward and closed the second folder gently. "I'm also not here to renegotiate the loan terms or to take any portion of Marcus's estate beyond what he intended for me to have. I have my own money. I have always had my own money." I looked directly at her. "I came here today because you told me 11 months ago, the week after I buried my husband, that you were retaining legal counsel to ensure I walked away from this family with nothing. I came here today to let you know that you cannot do that. Not because I want anything you have, but because no one gets to tell me I am worth nothing, not anymore." My mother-in-law's face was unreadable. Her attorney leaned over and spoke quietly into her ear. She did not respond. She was looking at me, and the look on her face was one I had never seen from her before, and I found I did not entirely know what to do with it. Garrett cleared his throat softly. "There is one final document," he said, "which Marcus had prepared and notarized 14 months before his passing, and which is straightforward in its language." He slid the third folder across the table, one to my mother-in-law and one to me. He left a letter, "For both of you." The room was still for a long moment. My mother-in-law opened her folder first. I watched her read, and I watched the thing in her face that I couldn't name move again, deeper this time, somewhere behind her eyes. She put the letter down after a while and looked out the window at the November skyline. I opened mine. Marcus's handwriting. I had not seen it in 11 months, and the sight of it did something to my chest that all of the legal preparation and the careful steadiness of the morning could not prevent. He had written in his usual way, slightly too fast, the letters leaning forward like they were trying to catch up with the thought. He had written that he knew exactly what he had asked me to carry, and that he was sorry for the weight of it, and that he loved his mother, and was sorry for what she was, and that he loved me in the way you love something you understand completely, which was different from most love, and better. He had written, "Take care of yourself first. You always forget to do that." I set the letter down. I looked at my mother-in-law across the wide mahogany table. She was still looking out the window. "I'm going to restructure the loan," I said, "reduce the interest rate and extend the term by 4 years. The company stays solvent. The employees keep their jobs." I picked up my bag from the floor beside my chair. "That's not a negotiation. That's what I've already instructed Cornerstone to do. The paperwork will be with your attorney by end of week." My mother-in-law turned from the window. "Why?" she said. It wasn't quite a question. "Because he loved you," I said. "And because I loved him." I stood up. I did not feel triumphant. I had not wanted to feel triumphant. What I felt was something quieter and more final, the specific sensation of a thing that has been held in tension for a very long time finally releasing, like a breath you forgot you were holding. I put on my coat. I shook hands with Garrett, who held mine for a moment longer than strictly professional, and said nothing, which I appreciated. I did not look at my mother-in-law again on my way out. In the elevator, going down, I watched the floor numbers descend through 42, 30, 15, lobby. I thought about Marcus's handwriting. I thought about the Honda, which I had in fact sold 3 months ago and replaced with nothing, because I had been taking cabs and I preferred it. I thought about the specific kind of silence that follows when something has finally finished. Outside on the street, Chicago was 31 degrees and not pretending to be anything else. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment and let the cold move through the coat and settle against my skin. And then I started walking toward the office. There was a new engagement letter waiting on my desk. A hospital system in Ohio, possible financial irregularities in the procurement department, 6 months of work, a solid fee. I had things to do. I had always had things to do. The Honda comment would never land again. Not because I had proven something to my mother-in-law or to anyone else, but because it had never been true, and I had always known it, and the only thing that changes when the proof finally comes out is that everyone else has to catch up to what you already knew about yourself. That night, in my apartment on the 14th floor of a building I did not own, and did not need to own, because I had learned a long time ago that the most dangerous thing about wealth was the way it could become the whole point. I opened my laptop and worked until midnight. At some point I made tea. At some point the city outside the window went quiet in the way cities go quiet at 2 in the morning, not silent but lower, like a frequency that only certain people can hear. I thought about what Marcus had written. Take care of yourself first. I closed the laptop. I went to bed.